Hello and welcome to a new video. Today we will make a tier list for Fire Water format. I have prepared 69 decks and I'm going to rank every single one of them, so be excited. Let's jump straight into the tier list. Starting with Mermail. Yeah, format is named Fire Water format because of Mermail, so Mermail obviously very strong deck. Has won a YCS historically, has dozens of other YCS tops. Some people might argue it belongs into S+, but I think it's S tier. It's strong, but it has definitely some weaknesses and counterplay. I think it belongs into S tier and it's not too broken to be considered S+. Now agents. I think the deck received some major buffs from the Firewater ban list, like Earth returned back from 2 to 3, also Archlord Christia went from 2 to 3 copies. However, the deck is still not at the same power level compared to Tangoplan format, where it would be one of the A tier decks or S tier, because Sangan is still banned. You could play this deck with Card Trooper and Call of the Haunt, which is at 3 in this format, but I think those decks are not the same power level compared to Tangoplan format, and in general the deck is power crap because cards like Silent Honor Arc exist, so I would put it into D tier. Hero Beat. I think this deck became a lot weaker with starters banned, so you need now 2 cards to set up a Miracle Fusion play and not just 1 E into starters, switching to Alios, so the deck lost the best opening play. However, this deck gained some new tools like the Masked Hero stuff. For example, Masked Hero Acid, really powerful card, Heavy Storm on the opponent, but I think with those new cards and without starters, I wouldn't put this deck higher than C tier. Archfiend. I really like this deck because I like dark and feed oriented decks in general. Unfortunately, it's not that good. It has some cool combos, but these combos end on a monster that is similar to Hyperion but requires so much more setup compared to just normal agents. Yeah, for this reason I would probably put it into D tier, could be above agents or below, because it has plays but these plays don't do that much. Battlin Boxer. It's one of those protected castle decks with player having protection against destruction by card effects for any Battling Boxer, and then it gains attack. So it can ramp up to really high attack values, so 30,800, not to underestimate. However, there is major counterplay with Silent Honor Arc and also Phoenix Chain, Breakthrough Skill, Dimension Prison. And with all of those removal cards in the format, I wouldn't put this deck higher than D tier. Blackwing. This one is really interesting because in Ravine Ruler format, people saw huge potential in this deck when Blackwing returned back to 3. Sehavi, which won Worlds in 2014, had actually a YCS top with Blackwing in Ravine Ruler format. However, the deck fell off pretty short later because people discovered that Dragon Ruler is just far superior and Blackwing in general is not that good. But I think with Vulcan as a new generic level 6, this deck has some really useful tools. And also the Delta, which is Heavy Storm in a format where Heavy Storm is banned, so this deck should belong into C tier, probably above Hero Beat. Could be also B, but I think C tier should be fine for this deck. Bujin, another one of those protected castle decks. It's kinda helmet, I don't really like it, but it has proven itself to be a very solid deck compared to the other protected castle decks. It just requires very simple setups like Tenki and Yamato, and then the deck can grind really well with just one Yamato. So it has won a YCS, therefore it belongs into A tier. Could probably win more YCS, but I think it's not at the same power level as Mermail. Chainbeat. This one is also pretty interesting. Most of people don't know what this deck does and how it works. Therefore, it can catch a lot of field by surprise and do some really nasty stuff with the Compulse. It shuffles the monster back into the deck, Chaining Thunderbird. It topped the YCS Vegas, but it's a bit passive, so I wouldn't rank it higher than B tier. Then Chainburn. Yeah, one of the most hated decks in every format, but this deck is playable, but it has proven itself to be a solid deck in YCS Berlin, 2 YCS tops. Also one very dirty transition site into Inzektor. So yeah, many people hate it and for this reason they don't want to play this deck, but when people decide to play this deck they can perform really well. I think this belongs into B tier. It has YCS tops in YCS Berlin. Chaos Dragon. Future Fusion still banned, but Chaos Sork returned back to 2, so this gives the deck more power plays to work with, but I think this deck is just not that good anymore, especially with Silent Honor Arc being able to break the Red Mat Light Pulsar loop. This has to be in C tier, could be near Agents. I don't know, let's rank it below Agents for this tier list. Catsith Chaos. One of the recently discovered new decks for Tangoplan format using the Chaos Force monsters and the fabled Catsith with discard cards to set up the graveyard for the Chaos monsters. This deck is a really solid control deck in Tangoplan format. However, Chaos Sork got limited in 2012, but then got semi-limited shortly before Firewater format, so it's back at 2, and with 2 copies of Chaos Sork I think this deck is playable, but it's overall power crapped. I think this deck should be above Agents, because in Tangoplan format both of these decks are at the same power level. However, this deck suffers more from Sangan being banned compared to Catsith Chaos. Cyber Dragons. This deck just became playable with the release of the Cyber Dragon structure deck during Firewater format. However, it's still missing some stuff, like for example Cyber Dragon Infernity, therefore maybe could top a regional, but I don't know, it doesn't seem that good. Dino Rabbit, I think this deck is severely crippled with Rescue Rabbit being limited. However, you could buy Gold Sock and then Tour Guide, banish the Rescue Rabbit, Levia, bring back the Rescue Rabbit from the banished pile and then make the combo. But I think the consistency of the deck isn't good enough anymore, and also the power plays are not really there. It can just sit on floodgates and protect them with Lagia, therefore Dino Rabbit should be at the bottom of the D tier, maybe F, but I think it could be viable on a locals level, so maybe D tier. Empty Jar. Firewater is actually the last format where Empty Jar as a deck is playable, because in the April banned list, Morphing Jar 1 and Morphing Jar 2 got banned in the April 2014 banned list. But I think this deck was never really good, so F tier, definitely. Psychics, one of the more rogue decks in the format, but people experimented with the deck in Wolfpack Open 7, and this deck is definitely capable of winning matches against the more solid decks in the format, so I think it has potential. Also, the lists I have seen are not really optimized yet. Maybe we could put this deck into C tier with a more optimized list, but right now I would put this deck into D tier, probably above Dino Rabbit, above Archfiends, maybe between Catsith Chaos and Boxer. Evol. Yeah, this deck is missing the trap card, and overall I think Jurrac is the superior Dino deck, so I would put this below Archfiend and above Dino Rabbit. Fablet. I think it's a really fun deck to play, and the deck received some small buffs with the White Dragon and the Black Dragon, which are floating non-tuners. However, this deck is pretty vulnerable against Disruption, and I think it's pretty hard for this deck to put out the really powerful synchros. Final Countdown, which is limited in Firewater format, therefore severe nerf against the deck. Many people hate this deck in prior formats, but I have no problem with it. But with Final Countdown at 1, I think this belongs into F tier, maybe below Empty Jar or above Empty Jar. 4-Axis Fire Fist, which has won the first YCS in historical Firewater format, but I think the reason for the early success is other decks were not solved yet at this point, while Fire Fist on the other hand got solved pretty early. Now with other decks getting better, Fire Fist becomes slightly worse, but I think it's still a pretty solid deck. Also, the deck has countless tops in retro Firewater format tournaments and has proven itself to be a viable contender. I think this deck still belongs into S tier, even though it got weaker over time. 3-Axis Fire Fist or 3.5-Axis. The much more fun version of the deck to play. I really love this deck to play, it's so fun. Unfortunately, it's pretty vulnerable against hand traps like Diddy Crow, Veiler, and those cards can be huge disruption against the entire deck. So it's a fun combo deck with OTK potential, but pretty vulnerable against disruption. So I would probably put this into the top of B tier. Then regular Frog Monarch, which was piloted by Lithium 2300 at the YCS Berlin. He went a 4-2 drop, but mentioned that he misplayed in the later rounds because of exhaustion. So I think this deck could perform better with great piloting, so I would probably put this into a C tier. Then the Lancer Frog, a more combo-oriented version of the Frog deck. I think this deck has more power plays compared to the regular Frog Monarch, so I would put this above the regular Frog Monarch. Fire King. Honestly, the historical builds of this deck suck, but even with those awful builds, people still got tops at YCS Berlin. But now, people like Justice Punch made the deck even better and performed really well in recent tournaments, so this has to be A tier at least. Geargia or Pure Geargia. Yeah, one of the strongest control decks in the entire format, especially with people starting to cut the Karakuri package in order to add more traps, more defensive stuff. The deck has 9 starters, so it's pretty consistent, and when a deck is able to start with armor, set 5 pass, it's probably out to win against majority of the decks. But sometimes it can feel a bit weaker if the opponent gets rid of the set armor with Bear or Atlantean Marksman. But despite this, one of the strongest control decks in the entire format, S tier, above Fire Fist. Geargia Karakuri. The Karakuri stuff adds more ceiling because we can go into synchro plays and play much more aggressive, but I think this deck doesn't really need that aggressive pushes because we can just win the game by outgrinding the opponent. So higher ceiling, lower consistency, and I think it's overall worse compared to Pure Geargia. I would put it into A tier. Gem Knight. Unfortunately, this deck has to play normal monsters in order to summon some of the fusion monsters. The deck literally has to play the Garnet, and Garnet is one of the worst cards to draw in other decks. So Garnet became a meme in later format. Unfortunately, the Gem Knight deck is just full of Garnets in my opinion, therefore F tier. Ghostrick. In the past, I would put this deck into F tier without a doubt, But then BMD came up with a really solid Chaos Ghostrick version of the deck using Dark Creator and Needle Sealing, and had pretty decent success in a single day tournament. So, and this kinda changed my mind on Ghostrick. So instead of F tier, I would probably put it at the bottom of the C tier. Gishki. This deck was kinda scary when people played the Gishki FTK in previous formats. Now the deck relies on other ritual monsters. And that's the problem, because ritual summoning in general sucks. Yeah, ritual decks before Necros just sucked. Therefore F tier. Gladiator Beast. The deck can definitely top if piloted correctly, and we saw Muri topping on one of the recent Wolfpack Opens. So it should be C tier. At least the question is where to put it into C tier. Maybe above Blackwings? Yeah, should be alright here. Dark World. Yeah, really controversial deck. Many people hate it, but I like it because I played it historically. But I think in Firewater format this deck is really balanced, because with Silent Honor Arc the opponent has counterplay against Graph, and when the Dark World deck has skill drain, then there is Crazy Box, which is an out against Graph under skill drain. Also Eradicated Epidemic Virus, which was one of the most toxic cards in the entire deck, limited, and card destruction banned. So with those changes, the deck is slightly more fair but still really powerful. I would put it into A tier. Gravekeeper. This deck bubbled twice as Atlanta, but to be honest, the twice as Atlanta build sucked. And now people made improvements to the lists and Tango Plant format. This deck became so much better in Tango Plant format with recent discoveries. And I think if we use the same deck building principles in Firewater, this deck can be at the bottom of the B tier at least. Gadgets. This deck didn't see that many success historically until YCS Chicago, when someone topped with gadgets. And I think the YCS Chicago list became the foundation for later gadget builds. So before the YCS Chicago, it was probably in the D tier. But then people in the Firewater community discovered that deck is actually really nuts. It feels kinda strange to put this deck into ST power level, but this deck is actually S tier and power level. I would put this deck slightly below Geargia. It has a very similar plays, but it's much more explosive. The deck can establish turn 1 Dweller against some of the graveyard oriented combo decks. The grind game is just insane. We have 9 starters, we have Exenas, we have recycling, while the turn 1 in Geargia is always really slow. This deck is super explosive. This deck can play true interruptions like Phoenix Chain or Valor using chain summoning. This deck could also punish anyone going second with Excitonite protected by Forbidden Lands. So yeah, similar to Geargia, much more explosive but slightly worse grind game because it doesn't have the float from the Gear Giant X like Geargia does. Gusto. A friend of me played this historically. Unfortunately, the deck is not that good. It kinda relies on the opponent attacking into the birds. And when the opponent stops attacking into the birds, this deck kinda has no really way to generate card advantage. Unless we have Creature Swap or E-Tele and Psychic Jumper. So with Gusto relying so hard on the opponent to misplay against the deck, unfortunately this belongs into F tier. Maybe even below Gishki. Harpies. This deck won YCS Sao Paulo, also has another spot in the top cut. Also has a really funny story with Jeff Jones $500 money match, which happened at the end of Dragon Ruler format or at the beginning of Firewater format. I can't really remember when it happened. So Jeff Jones piloted this deck really successful at the ARG, but I think it's not at the same power level as the A tier decks, so probably at the top or in the middle of the B tier category. Hazy Flame. I tested against it with decks that in my opinion belong into the D tier category, and this deck just lost against the D tier category decks, so F tier. Heraldic Beast. Historically, everyone considered this deck as trash, and therefore not many people played the deck historically. But recently, people came up with new builds for this archetype, with the Kage Tokage and Instant Fusion as level 4 extenders and Laval chain, and now with those new innovations, this deck becomes a pseudo gadget using the graveyard in order to extend instead of just searching from the deck directly. So the deck has potential with the recent builds. I would put it into B tier. Hieratc Ruler, one of the more heavy combo decks of the format. Unfortunately, sometimes it feels kinda inconsistent, and the deck relies on the opponent controlling a monster in order to start the combo with the Tefnoid play. And if the opponent decides to play around the Tefnoid, it's really hard to start their own combos. So the deck can be really dangerous and OTK lots of other decks really fast and spiral out of control quickly. But it's really glassy, can't run that many defensive cards. And also other decks could OTK Hieratc Ruler really fast because this deck doesn't have that much deck space for defensive cards. So very high ceiling but consistency issues. I would probably put it above Darkwood because it has the same consistency but slightly higher ceiling. Next one on our list, Hope for Exodia. One of the more gimmicky decks, but it can be really strong if the opponent doesn't know how to play against the deck and most of the times the opponent doesn't know it. I played the deck myself a bit on Dueling Network back in these days in Shaddoll BA format because Shaddoll had almost zero interaction against the deck, so it was kinda a decent counter pick against Shaddoll. However, in this format we have Dark World, which is almost auto-lose matchup, and other decks that have Mind Crush in the main or in the side deck could also potentially auto-win against Hope for Exodia, so I wouldn't put it too high, maybe somewhere in the middle of the C tier decks. Inzektor. Rank up OTK deck can be really scary if the deck is able to set up the combo of Dragonfly Hornet, but usually takes a couple of turns until it can achieve the setup. Overall pretty scary deck but takes a huge amount of skill. Not everyone is able to pilot this deck correctly. Therefore we saw a couple of YCS tops but not that many because this deck is also really hard to play. I would put this into A tier. Maybe above Geargia Karakuri? I don't know. Yeah, maybe somewhere here. Infernity, which has 3 Infinity Barrier in this format before the card got eventually limited down to 1 in the next spend list. However, the spend list change doesn't make a huge difference, because the main problem of this deck is the consistency. Some people already tried this deck out in Firewater tournaments, but it didn't perform that amazing. Overall, it felt really inconsistent, and even though this deck can end on some endboards with triple Infinity Barrier and break setup, which is borderline FTK against almost everything, it's just too inconsistent in doing that. While this deck is one of the most toxic deck in head format with Soul Charge at 3, it's not consistent enough without Soul Charge. So maybe A or B tier, but historically the deck had a couple of YCS tops, so I will put it into A tier. Jurrac. Also one of the Tengu plant decks that is theoretically playable in Firewater because Rekindling is at 3 and this deck really benefits from having 3 copies of Rekindling. The deck lost the 2 copies of Thunder King Ryo that were almost staple in every Tengu plant Jurrac main deck. However, this deck got also some new tools to work with like Blaster and additions to the Synchro toolbox, like Leo, Crimson Blader, Dallas Spark Dragon. So with those new options, I think this deck could definitely top a regional. I would put this into C tier. Maybe behind Blackwing. Geargia Karakuri, which won YCS Sydney, so it has to be at least A or B tier. However, this deck seems to be just a worse version of Geargia Karakuri, and Geargia Karakuri is just worse than pure Geargia. The main problem of the deck is obviously Exciton, which was introduced in Laval, so Exciton kinda beats the entire Karakuri endboard. Therefore, the deck didn't saw that much success after YCS Sydney. So post Laval, definitely B tier, because there are combo decks that are less fragile against Excitonite, like the Infernity, or probably 3-axis could be also less fragile against Excitonite, so somewhere in the B tier category. I will put it into the middle of the B tier. Next is pure Laval. Honestly, this deck just sucks. Even though we have 3 Rekindling, this deck is not capable of making any huge endboard except with high roll and can make Quasar. But even if we invest all of our resources to make Quasar Dragon in Laval, this can still lose against Mirror Force Finished Chain. This deck absolutely needs Rekindling, doesn't accomplish that much without Rekindling, and in general this deck doesn't accomplish that much, so I don't know, probably below Fabled or above Fabled, somewhere here. I will put it below Fabled and above Evol. Next one, Exodia FTK or just any library FTK. Yeah, the FTK rate of this deck just sucks. It doesn't FTK in like 40 or 50% of all games. And if a deck is not even FTKing half of the games to go first, then it's almost unlikely that you are going to FTK going second when the opponent has interruption like some Warning or Finished Chain or MST or any cards that could interrupt the FTK, which wouldn't be an interruption going first. So yeah, probably the worst deck in the entire format, F tier. Lightsworn. This deck got support from the Dragon Rulers because we can use the Dragon Rulers to banish the Eclipse Wyvern and then search the Judgment Dragon with Eclipse Wyvern and Dragon Rulers just by milling the deck, which is what the deck already wants to do. Unfortunately, the deck doesn't have the structure deck support that came out later this year. However, in head format, where the structure deck support would be legal, there's also Rhapsody of Berserk, which is a huge nerf because this card can take out the Lightsworn names from the graveyard and prevent the Judgment Dragon summon. So the support and the cards that destroy the deck balance each other out kinda, so I would put this into B tier category. Could be above Gravekeeper, I don't know, maybe below Gravekeeper. Madolche, which won the German Open, one of the biggest regionals in Europe at the beginning of Firewater format, piloted by Eugen Heid. So the deck is definitely a solid contender even without the Angeli. I would probably put it into B tier, maybe above Karakuri and Heraldic Beast. Yeah, maybe here. Malefic. This one is just a helmet stun deck and just sucks. Honestly, you're just auto-losing against one single MST. F tier. Probably still better than Gasto. Could be worse than Gishki. Could be better than Gishki. I don't know, I will put it below Gishki in the F tier category. Mecha Phantombeast. Yeah, this deck also just sucks. Like any deck that can summon level 7 monsters, like for example Mermail, is more consistent in summoning the boss monster of Mecha Phantombeast, which is the Mecha Phantombeast Dracossack. And because it's less consistent than any other deck in summoning their own boss monster, the Dracossack, definitely F tier. Maybe below Malefic. Yeah, I'll put it under Malefic right now. Morphtronic. So we have seen people experimenting with the deck in Tango Plant, but the deck could have some potential in Fire Water, but I don't really know the optimal build for the deck yet. So it has potential, but we need more testing with the deck. Right now I'm really unsure about the deck, so I will put it in the middle of D tier. Maybe below Archfiend, above Fablet, maybe here. Next one, Mythic Ruler. Instead of using the Heretics as a combo strategy, this deck relies on milling and draw cards like Cards of Consonance and Trade-in to get dragons and the Dragon Ruler itself in the graveyard. So it's kinda weird. Historically, not many people play this deck, but the people who play the deck at Retro Fire Water have been really successful. So I would put it above Hieratc Ruler. And maybe Dark World also above Hieratc Ruler, because this one is more consistent than Dark World, and Dark World seems to be slightly more consistent than Hieratc Ruler. But this one has a higher ceiling than Dark World, and Dark World has a higher ceiling than Mythic Ruler. Yeah, very similar decks, but small difference between each other. But all of them really solid A tier decks. Next one, Naturia. I've seen a bunch of deck profiles for locals, and I think this is where the deck belongs to, so somewhere at the bottom of the D tier decks. Ninja. This deck can set up really disgusting locks, but there are some decks that are completely hard counters against Ninja, like for example Madolche, which can shuffle their cards back, or Spellbook with the non-targeting banish. But in general, this deck seems to me like the entire game plan is to set up a lock and pray that the opponent can't out. With this game plan, this deck can't be higher than C tier. So somewhere in the middle of C. Yeah. Maybe at the bottom of C tier. Next one, Noble Knight. This one is kinda interesting because the effects read like a modern deck. You have so much text that the opponent almost doesn't want to read the card, but the opponent has to read every single of your cards with such a long text in order to make no misplays. And this is how some people were able to steal some wins historically, because the opponent was not willing to read the entire text of the Noble Arms, made misplays. But overall, this deck, despite having so cool artwork, it just sucks. Like one single MST and one Silent Honor Arc is able to break the entire board, and the entire Protect the Castle strategy doesn't work if the opponent has one single MST and is able to make the Silent Honor Arc, or just MST and finish chain until you have the Silent Honor Arc. So a bunch of outs against the main strategy of the deck. Also, this deck is not super consistent in setting up the Sacred King with the equip spells that make it untargetable, not being able to destroy it by card effects, and also protection against battle with 3k attack. So not really consistent, and the end board is not good enough anymore. So probably at the bottom of the D tier deck. Like honestly, Jurrac is so much better than Noble Knight. Next one, Evilswarm. This deck can be a really disgusting anti-deck against decks that special summon level 5 or higher monsters. But against other decks that don't special summon level 5 or higher monsters, this deck feels a bit underwhelming. This deck had some YCS tops, but I wouldn't rank it too high, so probably in the middle of the B tier category. Next one is Constellar, and the endboard of Constellar actually works against the majority of decks, because Pleiades bounce is actually really strong, and Pleiades can reset the tanky, and then you have follow-up, you have Bear. I personally think it's better than Evilswarm. Some people might disagree with me, but for this tier list, I would just put it above Evilswarm in the tier list. Next one is Quasar Turbo. It's really fun if you can summon the Shooting Quasar Dragon, but it's just a fun deck. Raccoon, which becomes finally playable with the Elva support like Obedience School. I recently made a video on the deck, and the deck is definitely able to beat some decks that are higher ranked in the tier list like Fire Fist or Bujin. But overall, the deck seems kinda weak on paper, but then when you play the deck, it can definitely do some strong plays. Like the Obedience School turn 1 ending on Gladiator Beast, and for some reason the deck actually topped the YCS Mexico and Vegas format immediately after Fire Water. It seems weird to put this into C, but it actually belongs into C tier. Scrap, another deck that is really strong in Tango Plant, but with Reborn Tango being semi-limited and also Thunder King Ryo being limited, the deck lost the majority of their level 4 non-tuners. Not really sure what would be the optimal build for Scrap in this format, but the engine of Scrap itself is not restricted, so you can still do the same plays, summon Scrap Dragon over and outgrind the opponent with the Scrap Dragon pops. So probably above Agent, below Catsith Chaos. 6 Samurai. The deck actually topped one of the Fire Water tournaments, one of the Wolfblock Opens, so it can accomplish something, but overall the deck feels really inconsistent and doesn't have that many options, so you just summon Qian and pray that you can protect the castle. So with this game plan, it could definitely top a regional, so C tier. Yeah, maybe above Jurrac, but not sure if this is the correct placement for 6 Samurai. Spellbooks, one of the top tier decks in the format. The deck has one of the best grind games in the entire format, with Tower being able to recycle all other books. A bunch of YCS tops, but no YCS win. However, this deck has 1, 2 or 3 tournaments in the retro format community, so definitely S tier. Maybe above Gadgets, but below Geargia. Yeah, this is probably in the middle, like here. Spirits, I think Thief topped a regional with the Spirits, so it should be at least C tier, and I think it could be probably in the middle or in the upper part of the C tier. Maybe here. TG Stun. TG Striker returned back to 3 in this format, so it has no banned list hits compared to Tango Plant format, besides Reborn Tango being semi-limited. However, I think you can find solutions for the TG Stun, like for example the Fire Fist approach, with Tangy, which is able to search the bear and the rhino, or we can also use the Barbaros and the Striker to synchro summon the Leo, which is such a broken synchro 10 in this format. One of the better D tier decks. I will probably put this at the top of the C tier deck, below Boxer, above Psychics. Thunder Family, another rank 4 spam deck, using different Thunder monsters and the Thunder Seahorse to search them. Overall, it takes a bit to set up because Seahorse locks you out of special summoning, so it's kinda slow, but can be still effective and has definitely some regional tops. So this has to be at least in the middle of C tier, probably below Spirits. Vylon. Similar to Noble Knight, a deck that is using equip spells, and equip spells are one of the worst game mechanics in the entire game, because if you lose the monster, then you also lose the equip spells. So you are almost always guaranteed to go minus in card advantage. The deck has also some synchro options, but using synchro monsters and equip spells makes the deck just so vulnerable against disruption. Like if you lose one of your synchro monsters, you just lose so many cards, and therefore this deck should be considered higher than D tier. Next one is What, which can establish the Hopper Lock, which is really hard to out unless you are playing Madolche or Spellbook or a skill train deck. However, there are a bunch of these decks that the What just auto-loses to them, and in general the deck doesn't have that many powerful plays besides Burn and Hopper Lock, so I will probably put this deck not higher than the bottom of the D tier. Yeah, maybe above Naturia, below Evol. Worm. The deck is kinda hard carried by the Nebula, which can go +3, +4, but that's it. I don't have any more positive things to say about this deck, so D tier. Might be still better than What, but definitely D tier deck. Next one is Wind Up. Unfortunately, no banner list changes that helped the deck in the recent list. They could have put the Wind Up Magician to 2 or 3, so huge nerfs to the deck with the limitation of Magician and with the ban of the Mighty. However, the deck has still some 2 or 3 card OTK lines that you can set up, and it is playable on a regional level, can definitely win matches in Fire Water formats against the other decks, so probably in the middle of the D tier category. Big Saber. I have friends who played this deck historically at the regional level and they claimed they went 5-3 or something like that, so definitely playable, especially with the new support of Leo. Also the deck has M7, which can recycle the Fault Roll, and then you can loop your Fault Roll for more synchro summons. The deck has definitely some cool plays. I think I will put it in the middle of the C tier. Last one in the tier list, Zombie, which got some buffs from banned list because Black Spell Zombie went back to 3, Mizuki went back to 3, and Destiny Hero Malicious went also back to 3, or probably was at 3 already in the Marine Ruler format. So with those 3 cards at 3, the deck has definitely some huge potential. I think it could be at the top of the C tier decks. Maybe above Blackwings. Yeah, probably above Blackwings, below Gladiator Beast. So this is the final tier list. If you want to make a tier list yourself, I will leave a link for the tier list maker in the video description. If you have major disagreements with the tier list, write them down in the comment section. See you in the next video.